Welcome back, everyone, to another edition of the Prove Me Wrong podcast. I'm your host, Pete Lieb. I'm glad you're all on board with me today. I have a great show lined up for you. We are going to talk Ted Bundy. He is maybe the most well-known serial killer in history, with Stephen Michaud, who is the author or co-author of 18 books in all. Many of them are in the true crime genre, including the book Ted Bundy, Conversations with a Killer, which has recently been made into a 4-part Netflix series. You may have seen it, featuring the tapes that were made during the interviews that were conducted with Bundy for the book. So who better to talk with and get a personal insight into maybe the most famous serial killer in history? So welcome, Stephen, to the Prove Me Wrong podcast.
Good to be with you, Pete.
Thank you very much. Once again, I've been looking forward to this show for a while. There has been some very real fascination with Ted Bundy for decades, and it extends to all serial killers generally in some fashion, but Ted Bundy in particular, and above all others. Seems like every couple of years it gets reignited again. There is a new movie or another book or some type of information from somebody who was even remotely connected to him, and it flares up again, and he's been gone now for 30 years. So it is really a pretty incredible phenomenon. But I want to start with you, if I can, by asking some of your history and kind of find out from you, how did you get involved in true crime?
Well, it was purely happenstance. The story begins in the early 1990s when I went to work at Newsweek magazine in New York City as basically a runaround guy. But I was used on a lot of true crime stories over the first couple, 3-4 years I was at Newsweek. And although it was hardly a specialty of mine, I found myself being assigned to these various stories. Then about 76, I left Newsweek to go to work for Business Week magazine, also in New York. And at about that time, I got a call from my agent, Kathy Robbins, in New York, and she said there's an alleged serial killer named Ted Bundy, who is in jail down in Florida, about to be tried for murder, and he claims that he's innocent. And he has sent word that he would be willing to talk to a journalist in exchange for a reinvestigation of the crimes for which he had been charged or was suspected, that ranged from Seattle, Washington to Florida. It sounded to me like a very unlikely situation,
right?
And I was preparing. I was taking Japanese lessons. I was on my way to Tokyo for McGraw-Hill World News, and Ted sounded like pretty much of a long shot to me. But I spent some time looking into his case. He was not so famous in New York as he was around the rest of the country at that time, but there was plenty about him. And the surprising news that Ted and I grew up about 5 miles from each other in Tacoma, Washington.
Oh, wow.
And even though I didn't know him, we were, a couple of years apart, and we actually had some friends in common. Not, we weren't part of the same group world, but he went to Woodrow Wilson High School, and I went to Clover Park High School, and so we had this strange connection. I remember telling my sister about it when I was considering the project, and she said, I was talking about how similar, all these strange similarities, and she said, "Well, have you ever killed anybody?"
Right.
And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, that's what Ted says."
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway,
but it wasn't.
Go ahead.
So it wasn't a fascination of yours or an interest of yours. It was just a job initially, right? Then getting involved in true crime. Okay.
Yeah, that was every journalist has in his or her heart a book or two.
Right.
And I was still not quite 30, and so I didn't have to get a book done immediately, but this was a chance to do something really interesting, because I figured if he's guilty, then I have the only interview with Ted Bundy, if the only in-depth interview,
Right.
and if he's innocent, wow, I get a guy off death row. But I also felt that this is not something that I was ready to take on by myself, so I contacted Hugh Ainsworth in Houston. Hugh had been a mentor of mine in my early days at Newsweek and had taught me a great deal about interviewing. He is, I don't want to talk about him past tense, he's a great interviewer, and a good investigative reporter. And as it turned out, he and I had done a serial killer story together in the summer of 1974. A guy known as the Candy Man had been kidnapping, or not kidnapping, actually, just luring young boys to his truck that he drove around Houston selling pralines,
Right.
and he murdered them. So I had a little experience and with that, and proposed to Hugh that we respond to Bundy as a duo, that I would talk to Ted in prison, and Hugh would go out to the West Coast and start reinvestigating the cases. And that's how it all started.
So was that the first time that you had ever been face to face with a murderer? Was Ted, or was there someone before that?
Oh, I'd interviewed some really, really bad guys, but they were just sort of garden variety bad guys. None of them had quite the panache, if you will, of Ted Bundy. He was not just another dirtball killer. So he represented far more of a challenge than anything that I had encountered up to that time.
What were your impressions of him when you got face to face finally? Your first impression?
Well, I'll preface that with there's a key to kind of understanding how it unfolded. And the key is that I had not the slightest idea of what sociopathy, sometimes called psychopathy,
right,
really amounted to or amounts to. I mean, I knew what everybody who's gotten through an undergraduate degree in college knows, is that it's a person who lacks guilt or remorse, and if they're criminally inclined, they can be very, very crafty, because they operate on a completely different scale, if you will, than the rest of us, and their only real interest in life is getting over on somebody else. It's like we're all on a power grid, and their objective in life is to have more power than you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not ready for it, you don't see it coming. And I wasn't ready for it. So as things started out with Ted, we wasted a lot of time with him just bullshitting me, and
right.
me not really understanding how it was happening.
That is a trick, right? I mean, you start going off, and I think Manson kind of did the same type of thing.
No,
just stream of consciousness, start railing, and you kind of have to try to pull him back in.
Well, yeah, and Ted wanted to talk. Ted saw the book as kind of a celebrity bio.
Yes.
He wanted to talk about the fact that, about his boyhood, and when he had a dog named Lassie, and that kind of, little tidbits that he thought that his adoring audience would be fascinated to know about. He had no intention, despite what he had said, of actually addressing any of his crimes with me, which created something of a problem, since I had a contract and a partner and no day job. I had to figure something out. So about 4 or 5 weeks into the interviews, I was pondering this problem, and it dawned on me, and just thinking that Bundy had always been was typically described as boyishly handsome, boyish smile, boyish this, boyish that. And I said, to myself, that he really is a boy. And I saw that in the prison with him. He acted like a 12-year-old. He could be peevish. He could be unreasonable. He acted like you know, like a 12-year-old boy. And so I decided to you know, what the hell? I had nothing else I could try. I said to, you know, myself, you know, when you have a 12-year-old boy and say you're sitting in your living room and a baseball comes through your living room window, if you go outside and there's a 12-year-old with a bat, you have a prima facie case that he did it. But he will not admit to it. Jimmy, did you just put that ball through? No, never. No, I don't. No, sir. But if you remove the confessional I and say to him, well, could you tell me, Jimmy, how you think it might have happened? You give them a way to speak freely without the confessional I. And so that on that slender thread, I went back into the prison and I said, Ted, you know, we're not getting anywhere yet. And he gave me this line. He said, well, I never promised you anything. And I said, well, you did.
Right.
But moving ahead here, you know, Ted, you know more about these cases than anybody else on earth by virtue of having been a suspect or a defendant in them. You have seen all of the crime, all of the crime scene photographs. You've seen all of the reports. You've talked to many of the investigators and your own attorneys. And on top of that, you have a degree in psychology. So you have some of the tools, at least, to handle this information and to process it and make sense out of it. So why don't you, Ted, sit back and tell me what sort of person you think might have committed these crimes. And I had no idea what was happening with him, but he grabbed my my tape recorder and kind of cradled it in his arms, in his hands, and off we went. He started talking about, and I had no idea what he was talking about at the start because it was a lot of kind of sort of twaddle, if you know, the way it sounded to me, about the disintegration of the nuclear family and how some young men can't handle the stresses of modern living and the images that they see on TV and the stresses and the inability to handle failure. And pretty soon we started getting into how does it come upon a young man to want to grab young women and take them off and kill them and then play with their dead bodies.
So he eventually did kind of try to give you a genesis into his reasoning, right? And so then that's kind of what you think what he was doing there to start. He was saying, I'm a product of my environment.
Well, in large part it was product of the environment, but also he, you know, once we got into this a little bit, so we had developed a modus, if you will. I would say things like, well, how do these different forces come together to create this person? And I remember vividly him saying, well, if he would have been raised in a repressive society like, say, Victorian England or communist Russia, he might have become a demon stamp collector. And he struggled all the way through our conversations, which went on, you know, for 6 months, with trying to understand himself, why he was the way he was, because he did not really have an idea.
Yeah, he was just kind of feeding you a line. I mean, I don't know. I have a hard time with that a lot of times because people always want to get in. And I've read that the FBI, the Manhunter book, you know, where they kind of talked about the genesis of the behavioral sciences department in the FBI. And, you know, you get in front of these guys and you're asking them what makes you who you are, you know, and then it comes back to, well, my mom didn't love me or my daddy wasn't around, or if I was in a different situation, things would be better. versus I'm just mentally deficient. I'm just broken in some way. So that's kind of where he was going with you. Did you find him to be a split personality, or did you find him to be some type of just mentally have some type of a screw loose of some kind?
Well, let me answer that question broadly.
Sure.
There's no doubt that what he was saying to me went through his particular filter,
mm-hmm.
And that he didn't feel the least bit of guilt for anything that he had done, and quite the contrary, was grateful as we went along with a way of talking about his murders and what he felt when he was doing it and the aftermath without having to confess, because he was sort of proud of it.
Right.
These murders were his big success in life. He had been a failure about everything else, including law school. But underlying all of this is that Ted did not see what was wrong with it. And he only would concede that it was wrong because he could see that everybody else, say in the courtroom, thought it was wrong.
Right.
But then there's another part of this that's important to know about, and that I learned about and did not know about when I went in there, is that Ted was typical in that he had generous doses of narcissism and paranoia,
mm-hmm.
Which is very common for serial killers. They are grandiose, self-regarding, and also deeply suspicious of others. And those two characteristics in combination can actually be very powerful in their lives, can make them very good at what they do, but in the end combine to help destroy them. And the example that I would give you is that these guys often so distrust their attorneys that they fire them and find themselves, that's their paranoid side, and then all of a sudden they're the center of attention and they get to ask the questions and look at the cameras, and their narcissism takes over. And the combination in Ted's case and in other cases is deadly. So looking back to your question again, he was, I believe, genuinely groping for a way to understand why he was different.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't think he was different like bad, but he was just different, and you could tell because other people regarded him as an aberrant freak, which he was, of course. And so we had a lot of conversations that kind of went off into the ether because he didn't have a grasp of what he was talking about, quite frankly.
And even then, at this point, to your point, they have this need to control. And I think a lot of the problem with the reason they commit the crimes is this need for control. And so then that transfers to the trial. And like you say, he has a need to control the trial process. So he becomes his own lawyer. He has a need to control your interviews with him. So he's rambling about things and not giving you necessarily what you want. Until you kind of mind trick him into making him not culpable for any of it. So not culpable in the legal sense, right?
Ted was often, when I would be pressing him for details that clearly would implicate him in these killings, he would say, "Well, I don't know, I'm just speculating," and I said, "Well, fair enough, Ted, but is it your point that you're innocent?" And he would say, "It's my position that I'm innocent." A very important distinction, but one very important distinction to him, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like he could exist in two worlds. There's the real world where common sense tells you, yeah, he did it. And then the Ted world where it says, well, if it's not proven beyond a shadow of doubt, then it didn't happen. And he had the ability, the amazing ability, as far as I was concerned, to so compartmentalize what he had done that he could say to us on a number of occasions. He said, I the past is not real. You can't touch the past. You have to live in the present. The past doesn't matter to anybody. Well, he's completely trivializing all of that stuff. Well, I'm a good guy now, and so let's just forget that ever happened. It was very, very strange to live through that kind of mental gymnastics.
He comes off just creepy as hell to me in every interview I've ever seen of him. His mannerisms, the intensity of his face, everything he does just comes off really terrible. So is that the way it was in real life as well?
No, he was. People who were pretty close to him, girlfriends, guys that he had known, who were absolutely flabbergasted to learn that he had been charged with these crimes, much less that he was guilty, because he had built this really credible front, what one psychiatrist once called the mask of sanity, and that only rarely, and often only in retrospect, did people say, Ted did go off every now and again, and he was a little strange. But, if you cut him just a little bit of slack because he was good looking and charming, you would overlook that. The only people who really, really knew what Ted was doing were the ones who saw him as they were dying. And they weren't around to tell the story.
And in terms of that also, I actually read something or heard something somewhere where it said that he typically had very bright blue eyes, but when he would start to talk about what he had done or think about what he had done, that even his eyes would start to turn differently. I mean, did you see anything like that? Was there any type of facial difference that happened?
Yeah, I think I may have been your source for that.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. And I wasn't the first person to notice it. A couple of his boyhood friends, one of them at least, told me that when Ted lost his temper, that his eyes would go black. And I thought, well, that's a little bit of an over dramatization.
Yeah.
But when I was with him, when he got really intense about talking about these cases, yes, his eyes would go black. And he also had, and this sounds even more, this is like Area 52 stuff, but I swear to you that a kind of welt would start across about the bridge of his nose and move across the right side of his face, like somebody was scratching him, right? And that it would get white. It was just like a white line. And then when the tension passed and we were back, back on Earth, I guess, it would go away. It was like some kind of psycho motor thing that he did, and it was really weird. It was like, I could tell something strange was coming if that thing showed up.
So you say, I did read somewhere also that you say you realized pretty early on that he was guilty. He was guilty as hell, I think, in the term that I read. So So why do you think he continued to refuse? You just think it's just his psychosis that makes him continue to refuse to simply come out and say plainly, I did it and here's how?
Well, he was living in what you might call legal world. He was persuaded that they had not proven him guilty to the letter of the law. And, he had on one level a point. They never found a single fingerprint. There were no eyewitness accounts, except for one girl who got away from him, who identified him in court, and another who identified him in profile. She saw him in the dark in the downstairs of this sorority house. They had no, of course, in those days they didn't have DNA, and they had no confession. So, if you consider that you have a fairly high standard if you're going to convict somebody of murder one, his thing was that, well, you didn't convict me of it, so I'm still innocent. Now, he was offered in Florida, he was offered a plea deal that if he gave up the murders that he committed there, that he could go to prison for the rest of his life, and that would be it. And he came back and said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll go to prison for the rest of my life, but I won't confess. And they said, well, no, you can't do that, Ted. And so, you know, in the end, he was not only convicted, but he, you know, his appeals failed, and he was in fact executed, although he could have avoided execution. It was that strong in him, in other words.
Yeah, that to me seems like such a weird conundrum there, because you know, he says he won't confess. He'll do life, but he won't confess to it. He wouldn't confess to you. But to me, his actions seem to me like he wanted to get caught. And I mean, what I mean by that is he's telling people his real name. I mean, he refuses to change up his the Volkswagen. He's stealing Volkswagens in Florida after he's been identified with them several times. It seems like he's making the same. He just kind of keeps on keeping on, almost like he wants to get caught, but then he's completely he'll deny when it comes down to it. So it was always weird to me.
Well, you're right. It is said of the sociopath that he or she, interestingly enough, does not have the capacity to learn from his or her mistake.
Exactly.
They are, they're on one level, they're very shrewd students of the human condition, because they have to mimic how other people act in order to get through life. And so if you're not any good at it, you get caught, and there you go. Mm-hmm. So yes, and that was key to him. But to make your point even stronger, Ted was arrested 3 times after he became, or actually when he became and after he became a suspect. And all 3 times he was driving erratically late at night in places with which he was unfamiliar, and thus drew attention to himself.
Right.
And in 2 of those cases, he was driving Volkswagen.
Exactly.
So he made the same fatal mistake at least 3 times. And it wasn't because he was stupid. It's because these people or this person at least, was in the throes of a passion, if you will, and that he was just reverting to sort of like any predator that has done something successfully 50 times. It's hard for them to change, right?
It was a demon. It was a demon he couldn't control, right? I mean, he could not logically think through, okay, I need to change up my process. It was such a strong emotional feeling.
I think he did think of it, but I think it was too strong for him. He did really stupid things.
For sure.
And I remember talking to him about that, and he said, this person at times felt invincible, that no matter how much he screwed up, he couldn't be caught. Again, there's the narcissism, right?
Absolutely.
But in his second escape from the jail in Colorado, and then his fugitive time down in Florida, he took all kinds of risks that should have gotten him caught. They didn't, until he finally engineered his own arrest for the last time in Pensacola by driving a stolen Volkswagen erratically in a strange neighborhood. So there you go.
I just feel like he would have lasted about 3 days in today's society with the technology we have now and the social media we have now and the mistakes that he was making. He would not have had the opportunity to ultimately be what he was. I mean, he got caught up in the perfect time because, to your point, there was no DNA. It was local media. There was nothing necessarily nationwide at that point. Everything was segmented. He was really operating in the perfect time for what he was doing.
I agree. I think that's a key to understanding Ted, is that he was presented with a need, a desire, to essentially try to make real his fantasy world, because that's what they all are doing, is trying to live fantasies out. And he took what you gave him, and in that case, it was the anonymity of driving from small town to small town, the lack of fear among people of strangers. I would say, however, that if you transported Ted ahead 30 years or 40 years to today, he'd be working on the internet, and he probably would be pretty good at it, because that's the new area of opportunity. You can't approach young girls in parking lots anymore, and you're not going to get a lot of them walking alone down country roads. So I'm sure if Ted were back, if he were to be reincarnated, God forbid, he'd be an avid internet user.
So I'm glad to talk to you because you've actually been in the room with him. I always found it incredibly difficult to believe that he could walk up on me and within 20 seconds, I couldn't tell in my gut that there was something wrong with him. But again, I only saw him in interviews after the fact. So you're saying he could pass off as sane enough that he could lure sometimes 2 people in a day into his car and take them off and murder them, and no one was the wiser about it. He was that good.
Well, I'll tell you something about that, is that when Ted was first arrested and was first being tried and was convicted basically on eyewitness testimony of the girl who got away, he was sent in Utah. He was sent to the state prison diagnostic facility, and they basically studied him for weeks. They gave him all their tests that they could, and I've seen all of these tests. I've read them all, and the only way that you could say that you had found something that was, that bothered you about Ted, was to first posit that he was guilty in the first place. If you did not do that, if you just said, okay, this is a blank slate, I'm going to use all of my tools and my education to see what kind of guy this is, they came up with Zippo. It was, you had to posit the fact that he was a killer in order to say, I have found that he is a killer.
Yeah, you're probably right about that. You're probably right, because everything I've ever seen was, again, much after the fact. And at that point, I'd already been told of what he was and what he had done. And so you go into it with that notion. That's why I wanted to ask you that question, to see if, at the time, you say you didn't know much about him at all from where you were from. So that's invaluable, just to kind of see how he actually came off in real life and how he could have done that. That's great.
I'll give you an anecdote.
Sure.
Ted was shopping for an appeals attorney, and so one of them contacted me through Hugh, and I arranged for him to go interview Bundy in his jail cell as he was awaiting being returned to prison. So it was a little county jail, and I remember driving the guy up, and this guy was a real hot shot criminal attorney, and he went in for a couple of hours and came back and got in the car, and I was driving him to the airport, and I said, so what did you think of Ted? And he looked at me and he said, a very, very personable sociopath.
Yeah.
And it's one definition of Ted that doesn't have any, it isn't refined, but it's inclusive. And it tells you in some ways all you need to know about him, is that he was, what's the word that is used today? Something is turned into, he was weaponized.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
and that was Ted. He was it was quite a day at the beach. No doubt about that.
So how did he ever mention, well, I guess maybe he wouldn't. I also wondered how he maintained relationships with women, but then at the same time was killing women. Was there ever a time, and maybe that's something I talked to with maybe some of his people who were in relationships with him, ever times when they thought he might kill me, I've always wondered about that. How do you turn that on and off? Because it was an emotional thing. It was hard for him to control, but he had relationships with women that lasted years.
Well, one factor to bear in mind is that it was critically important for him, as is true of other sex killers of his type, to depersonalize his victims. That the more they became living, breathing people to him, the less he could reduce them to an abstraction, essentially, and that's how he did view them. I remember him talking about looking at the newspapers after he had committed a murder and being amazed that there was all this big fuss about this missing co-ed. Like, so what,
Mm-hmm.
He had a girlfriend who has written a book named Liz Klepfer, and she has written that in retrospect, she's pretty certain that he came close to killing her a couple of times. And there were we met some of the girls who had dated him, and he had done strange things like going for their necks a little bit too vigorously. And I sort of intuit from all of that Ted often, when he was really in the grips of his passion, that he was just barely controlling himself in order to get where he needed to be or wanted to be. This was a really, really overpowering lust, and that the objective was so attractive to him. He so wanted to, as he said to me, possess them as if you would possess a Porsche or a potted plant. That he lost all his orientation, if you will. It was that powerful. It was that undeniable in him. Go ahead.
Once you got him talking, how many murders did he talk about? How many? I know that he wasn't convicted of all the ones he was suspected of. Did he give you anything more on any others that he wasn't convicted on?
No. And Ted was always mindful of not giving me a key that only the killer would know about. So that, and he was really, really familiar with every last stitch of evidence in every one of those cases, at least the ones that had been investigated. And he did not go afield, talking about cases that I knew nothing about. He did, he would from time to time say, well, let's posit that on occasion he was out and he was trying to control himself and maybe decriminalize himself, I think was the word that he used. And so he went out thinking that he would just commit a case of rape. And then he goes through this whole thing where he meets a girl in an orchard and he rapes her, and then she fights back and he throttles her, and then he runs away and he comes back and he finds that she's dead. So we figured out, sort of where this had to be, and we went to Utah, and Hugh was out trying to recount, figure out from where Ted was living, how far this was and how many steps and all the rest of it. He's standing in the middle of this enclosure, this enclosed area, and an apple fell on his head. And it was the orchard that Ted had mentioned, and in his third person, and so it simply demonstrates that Ted very often probably did go weave back and forth between actual real recollections and doctored recollections, so that he didn't give anything away. I've never described my conversations with Ted as confessions. They were conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the first things we did when it was over with is take these tapes to various psychiatrists and forensic psychiatrists and played them for them, and asked their opinions. And some of them we told them who it was, and some of them we didn't. And there was a remarkable unanimity among these guys that they were hearing a sociopath, a homicidal sociopath, talking about his killings.
So when the apple hit Hugh on the head, was that really the end of the Innocence Project? Was that the end of the discussion, whether or not he's innocent or not?
It was. He had told me the story that he had gone out and he was trying to become a rapist, maybe on his way to becoming an altar boy. I don't know. But he talked to me in the third person about being in an orchard. And so Hugh goes out and sees if we can find that orchard, and he's walking around out there and an apple falls on his head. So yeah, we found the orchard.
There you go.
Yeah. So, but again, that's not going to, that's not going to be of any use in any courtroom.
So what do you think is this lasting cult following? Where does that come from? I mean, to this day, it's been 30 years. To this day, Ted Bundy has a following of people that's significant. What is? Maybe I'm asking you to be a junior psychologist in your own right now. What was it about him that you gleaned from your conversations that has fed this cult following? Is it just the attractiveness? It can't just be because he was good looking, right? I mean, that can't be it. Can it?
No, he was good looking and he was young. He dressed well. I mean, even though all of his clothes were stolen, he stole good clothing that fit him. He was very glib. Ted was not exceptionally bright, but he was very verbal. And he was able to sort of put on this affect of how to put this. Women generally were not put on any. They when they met him, they weren't at first saying, "This guy is really, really weird." That he was credible. And I've had any number of women get in touch with me who talked about going out with Ted, how their parents were really happy that they were, because Ted was such a foursquare young Republican, and and so he demonstrated the fact that if you are at all capable and you're determined, but for the longest period of time, you can move undetected in society, picking and choosing your victims pretty much at will. And it was a big deal to him that he took what he called high value victims, because part of what he was doing was taking society's daughters away from them. He was killing the most important things in these families' lives, and he had this deep, abiding hatred, anger that's absolutely evident in what he did to these girls before and after he killed them. It was a huge anger, a sexual anger, but also a social anger. Ted had a big mad on, and that probably is the enduring mystery of Ted Bundy, is why. There's hints he had, there were some things in his boyhood that were a little off, but nothing that you could put your finger on that is known.
I've heard he was the product of incest. Is that a wives' tale? Is that false?
Well, it has been widely believed that his grandfather was his father. It turns out that's not true.
Okay.
And I was one of the people who thought it, but it's not true. Now, whether or not his mother was raped or had sex with another member of the family or something like that, we don't know. She certainly never told the truth about who Ted's father was, but there's some things that were and remain for me a real mystery. One of the major ones is that Ted claimed to me and to a lot of other people that he discovered that Johnny Bundy, his mother's second husband, was not his father when he was a teenager, at 12, 13 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now Louise had married Johnny when Ted was about 5. And I just do not believe that a 5-year-old could all of a sudden see this strange man come into the house and make babies with his mother. And all of a sudden at age 13 figure out that he was not his father. I mean, it's kind of, it just is, and somebody as smart as Ted, I think that there was some kind of real issue that Ted had with Johnny, that was pre-literate, that he never could really articulate. And that, he probably, I mean, I'm really being a curbside psychologist now.
Sure.
But there was something really, really off about that family. That, I asked him, I said, well, did you ever ask your mother about any of this stuff? He said, no, we never talked about anything like that. And, and his mother, I remember when Hugh and I went to talk to her to tell her that the book was finished and we were going to tell the world that her son really was a killer, which up to that point she had adamantly insisted he was not. And so we went to their house with some audio tapes, and listened to them with Louise and Johnny, and it was pretty tense. It was about a half an hour of excerpts, and I remember she made these little sounds like a mouse, and I wasn't sure what that was about. But in any event, we finished it, and she looked up and slapped her knees, and she said, "How about apple pie and ice cream?" And we had apple pie and ice cream.
So she was able to compartmentalize the same way he was. Maybe his was a learned behavior.
Yeah, well, or I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that could
or an inherited defect. One of the two.
Yeah, who the hell knows? But she just was impervious, at least outwardly, to anything. I mean, she just listened to her son talking about tearing people apart, and she puts on her mask, and we eat apple pie and ice cream.
So did you feel like there was ever a point in your conversations, you say you were spending 6 months together, was there ever a point that you felt like he thought of you as a friend, or was it always, was there always a distance between the two of you?
Well, the sociopath in him couldn't treat me as a friend, because the real friendship requires emotions and feelings that were kind of beyond Ted. We laughed and talked a lot. When he was, I remember one time, I've told this story before, but we were just not talking about anything, and I said, Ted, now with your celebrity status, you ought to consider product endorsements like crowbars and the like. And he didn't flinch, and he said, the camera discovers me in my cell with my hands on the bars, and I look at the camera and I say, "Hi, I'm Ted Bundy, and I'm about to be executed, and I can't tell you how it burns me up that I'll have to go in my Burlington socks." And the socks thing was that he was a sock fetish, and when they caught him in Florida, he had about 30 or 40 pairs he had stolen. But that was the kind of gallows humor, you could say, that he was capable of. He rarely made fun of himself. He didn't have that kind of humor, but he was able to detach himself completely, at least from time to time.
So he wasn't one of those people. He was not someone who kept trophies of any kind. There was never anything found from any of the victims on him.
No. But he had a conversation with an FBI agent in which he said that he had, at one point, 5 skulls that he had kept in his in the cabinets in his kitchen. And I think there were 1, 2, 3 body dumps that they discovered in the state of Washington. 2 for a fact, 2 for there was no doubt about it. And their heads were all severed from the bodies. So yeah, he probably did keep souvenirs. He told another story that when he was being questioned, he didn't tell me this story, he told somebody else, that he was being questioned by a detective sergeant in Utah, who had surprised him at home, that he had a big handful of photographs of his victims that he quickly stuffed behind a duct on the building furnace. They were 2 inches away from him as he was talking to this guy. Pictures of his victims. So, yeah, Ted. I'm pretty sure that Ted kept souvenirs. He just was never caught with them.
When your 6-month process was over, when you had the tapes and you were ready to write the book,
right?
How was your life different? Did that time with him staring there and talking to someone like that, how did that change you? Did it change you?
Oh yeah. What happened was I started in January of 1980, and Hugh went west, and then by June I couldn't handle it anymore, and I said, I'm not talking to this guy anymore, Hugh. You finish it. And there was some element of the good guy bad guy thing, because Hugh was an old time police reporter, and I had treated Bundy fairly carefully, and so when Hugh went in there, he said, Hugh had no patience with a lot of Ted's nonsense. I remember him saying, explain to me, Ted, what you get by sticking something up a girl's vagina. What is that about? And he said, it's not normal. And Bundy would snap back and say, of course it's not normal. But that yielded some stuff, because Hugh didn't let him hide behind a lot of his verbiage that he did with me. In my personally, it was quite a while after I last saw him that the writing took, because it was my editor. I tried to write it in the third person, and she said, "No, you've got to write this in the first person." And I'd never written in the first person, and I can guarantee you, if you're not used to it, it's not easy. But it required me to examine what I thought about Ted, because I was, I had to talk about what it was like to be in there. But overall, it's sort of like the times in anybody's life where an event completely changes who you are, maybe not outwardly, but permanently, and maybe not in major ways. But there's an old rock and roll song with a line in it that I wish I didn't know now what I didn't know then. And sometimes I think about that because, Ted left a stain. He left a stain on everybody he was around, but he certainly left one on me. And so there have been lots of times where, if it were possible, if I could give it all back, I certainly would have. But now, it's now 30, 40 years later,
Right.
and I haven't gone on to witness worse, but I certainly have a benchmark for what people can, in the right circumstance, will do to one another.
So let me ask you one last question before we wrap it up here. And I really appreciate you coming on and talking to me. This has been fascinating to me. In your opinion, why do seemingly right-thinking, normal people become infatuated with individuals who are just obviously mentally defective? And I'm not just not talking Ted specifically, but kind of all of them. The serial killer in general, and the level of fame that these people have, and following, and they're marrying in prison, and they're getting fan letters. And what, again, I'm just that same junior psychologist hat on. What is it about that infatuates so many people?
I don't have a definitive answer to that. Sitting in that interview room with him, with right deep inside the prison, when there were windows all around, so it's like living in a little fishbowl, if you will. And I never knew when some officer or guard was going to come in and say, "We've been listening to your conversation, and Bundy, you're going back to your cell, and Michaud, come with me," right?
Yeah.
Because I was not supposed to be in there. I had to use a little subterfuge to get in to see him. But I remember that the way I dealt with him was to achieve some of the detachment that he had. That I would, the only way I could listen to all that stuff was to kind of put up a wall, or whatever you want to call it, so that it reached my cerebrum, but not my my ancient brain. And out of that, I can tell you that I think there's an element of, when you go to the zoo and you see wild animals, or at least they're supposed to be wild animals, and they're only 20 feet away from you, that you get this little frisson of wow, I think that has something to do with it with Ted.
Yeah.
You're just this fascination of seeing a shark under glass, if you will. And again, that he was so credible. He was not, he didn't froth at the mouth or talk to himself, and he washed and dressed well, and I think he really, in an important way, disabused society of the feeling, or that you can recognize something that is really evil, if you want to use that word, deadly, and that person can move right next to you, and you would not have the slightest idea. You could have dinner with them. You can go to bed with them, and you would have not a clue of what they were capable of doing at any minute, perhaps to you. That they can move unseen and undetected through society. I think somewhere deep inside that always has been. It was troubling at the time, and I think to some extent it still troubles people. That how did he do it? How did he become? How he was so credible, and yet he was so damn successful. How do you put those two things together? So that's not an answer. That's just me kind of musing on that, because I've thought about it a lot. Right.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and I'm there with them, and I ask you that maybe try to help me as well. I'm right there. I mean, I am also, I watch the ID channel. I watch all those serial killer shows. Yeah. You're right, and I think you had a really great analogy there to be, the shark under glass, and you can feel the fear, but you are relatively safe from the fear.
Yeah.
So I can get it. I totally can understand that. Once again, thank you so much, Stephen. It's Stephen Michaud for joining the show today. It has been a tremendous conversation. I'm really happy that you were able to join me. Would you like to spend just another moment and let the listeners know out there how to find you for more information, your website, how to purchase any one of those 18 books that we've talked about? I'm assuming they're on Amazon. You can find them there.
Yeah, well, they're all on Amazon. I have a website, stephenmichaud.com. You just Google me. There's a lot about
Absolutely.
me. And on the internet, and I'm certainly, well, you found me, so it's not that hard
for sure.
Yeah, so maybe I ought to change my name to something and go into incognito. Maybe I could go out and start killing. Who knows? Right?
No, you have too much information to go incognito. I mean, I would love to talk to you again. I know that, again, Ted Bundy is not the only true crime that you've done. You've done several. And again, I'm a fan of that genre. So I would love to talk to you again if the time can work out. And I thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, you're entirely welcome. And you were a polite and attentive questioner, and I appreciate that. And you've done your homework, and that's good. So we can actually get beyond the obvious to the interesting. And so that was good for everybody, I think.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate it. We'll talk to you again.
Good. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
And once again, that was Stephen Michaud. He wrote the book, Ted Bundy, Conversations with a Killer. Fascinating stuff. You go through and all you see, and I'm of an age when all I see is what I've been shown on television. So at the time you get to that point, Bundy's already been convicted. Hell, by the time I became really in that sphere, he was already dead. I mean, he was killed. It was executed in 1989. I was only 16, 17 at the time. So it was really awesome to have an opportunity to talk to somebody who was in the room, could sit there with him and kind of fill in the blanks that I've always had in terms of how do you let this guy walk up on you, talk to you, and not realize that he is just batshit crazy right off the bat. It really kind of seemed to me like my crazy radar would go off almost immediately, and you'd kind of know in your stomach that this person's bad. But apparently, he could get away with it, and he did not give that off, which is really impressive to me. So what do you think? What are your thoughts on it? I mean, do you think that Ted was unique, or do you think that Ted was, like most other serial killers, kind of the garden variety psychopath who had these just uncontrollable emotional urges that would not allow them to think rationally and even change up their MO? I mean, he again got caught doing the same type of thing over and over and over again, making the same mistakes. If you have any questions, if you're interested in contacting us, you can contact us through the Prove Me Wrong podcast email address. It's provemewrongcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook. Just look up Prove Me Wrong. You can find us on Instagram as well. Prove Me Wrong is the title on that as well. Or you can just pull us up on SoundCloud, iTunes, the podcast app, Stitcher, Tunein Radio, really anywhere you find podcasts, you can find the Prove Me Wrong podcast. You can also click like and subscribe to this YouTube channel. I will be posting the podcasts on YouTube as well to allow you to kind of get a feel for what it feels like to be in the Prove Me Wrong podcast here in the lap of luxury. But I would love to hear your feedback and what you think about what we've talked about today with Stephen Michaud and Ted Bundy. I really think it's, it taught me some things I didn't know, things I wasn't prepared to hear, really. So before I sign off, I do want to say that this episode of the Prove Me Wrong podcast is brought to you by our friends at Zendozones from JT Eaton. They are shaped like fearless little bug-repellent tiki gods. So they're citronella candles. So let Surf and Stan, Hawaiian Howie, and Luau Lily bring the islands to your backyard with Zendozone citronella burners. They use natural 3% citronella candles with incense cones, and they're perfect for patios, decks, backyards, campsites, poolside, prison, and more. They're available online on Amazon or at Ace, and collect them today. So for Stephen Michaud, I'm Pete Lieb. This is the Proving Wrong podcast, and we will talk to you again soon.